I wanted to welcome everyone to Jesus for Mormons today. I am joined by Steven Pynakker. Hey, Steve, how you doing?
Doing really good, Kai. How are things up there in Hawaii?
Oh my gosh, another beautiful, gorgeous day, and I'm super grateful that you are joining me on the podcast today. Number one, I want to put it out there, when our podcast was nothing and had no viewership at all, I had this huge fish reach out to me by the name of Steven Pynakker and say, hey, come on my podcast. And you reached out to me, which I thought was really cool. And I really appreciate.
Yeah, I think it's important to me to get more evangelical voices on my channel. Throughout the years, even from the beginning, I've had evangelicals, including one of the first ones was Sandra Tanner. So I really feel it's important that this is a space where all the voices are heard.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, and it's been interesting for me, and I like having open and candid conversations. We've had open and candid conversations, more so in private, right?
Yep.
Since that has happened. And my, being associated with you and being on your podcast has also kind of gotten me a little bit of maybe negative attention on the evangelical side. And I think it's important to kind of talk about that. And I think it's important to talk about it on Jesus for Mormons and have just a discussion about it in general. And so when we talked about it on the phone, I said, Steve, is there any question that is too hard for you to answer in this interview I want to do with you? And you said, my impression was, go for it, Kai. Is that kind of where we left off?
Yeah, I'm that's what I do. So I'm not afraid to ask the hard, tough questions, and so I got to be consistent, right?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. And in preparation for this, and I'll put it in the show notes below, I was reading an article that was written by Aaron Shalafalov,
yes,
which was on Steve Pynakker. That was one of the things that was through MRM. And what I can do is I can share, that article, down below. I think we might touch on a few things in this interview. And then I also was reading up on I don't know what I would call it, a letter through Fred Anson. Is Steven Pynakker an evangelical Christian? Okay, Steve, these are not new documents to you. These are not new things to you. I'm sure you've read over them.
A little bit. I read over them when this whole thing was released last September. I actually haven't really looked at them since. Other people have. I sent it out to a handful of people, including many evangelicals, who were just quite disappointed in their response towards me. And I was a little disappointed as well.
Okay. Yeah. And I think I really want to talk about this because I think it's important to not have people talk past each other, not have there be this dialogue of contention. I think that in Christianity, there needs to be a lot of unity. I agree. And a lot of strength where Christianity comes from that position, and not from a sense of crabs in a pot. Let's try to tear people down. Yeah. That's what I would call it. I don't know if people are familiar with the idea of a crab in a pot, but it's this idea that as some crabs could escape and do good things with their life, but other crabs pull them down and bring them back into the pot. If any of us have ever thought about that. And I just want there to be an open dialogue with this. At the end of this conversation, I wrote down 2 goals that I have. The number one goal is that God is glorified in our discussion. Like, that is the number one goal. And the second goal is for my viewers to have a better sense of who Steven Pynakker is. Do you think those are fair goals, Steven?
Let's have at it. It sounds fair to me.
Okay. So one of the first questions I want to ask you is, what does evangelism look like? Like, what is the purpose of your channel in evangelizing to people who are Mormon, ex-Mormon, evangelical? Like, what does that look like to you?
And I think, and I actually kind of want to kind of contrast it with proselytizing.
Okay.
I think evangelism is living and sharing the gospel in any way that it manifests itself. And by what I'm trying to do is model good Christian behavior by how I actually conduct myself, so that people can see that I'm not just talking or saying things or writing things out on my computer, but I'm actually living out the principles that I believe in and actually operate in that world. So evangelism to me is having dialogue, having conversations, be respectful of people from different viewpoints, and also point out when we have differences. And so I have Latter-day Saints come on all the time. And what I try to do, and I have a large Latter-day Saint audience, I've had Latter-day Saints tell me, "Oh, we watch your program because at any moment the Holy Ghost might show up." They get spiritually edified by watching my program, which to me, I want to edify people. I want the Lord to work through me. Not that it's my work, but it's his work through me to just help draw them closer to Christ and having a personal relationship with the Savior. And that to me is actually the most important thing. And I always tell people, and this gets taken out of context, and this was taken out of context in one of those pieces that were done on me. So I don't care what building you go to on Sunday morning. God don't care what building you go to. The question I have for you is, do you have a personal relationship with the Savior? Which they always leave that out. And I think it's really important that that's there, because I want people who are in their faith journeys and their faith walks. I'm not there. I want to meet you where you're at. So, and a lot of people don't understand there's a lot of things that go on off camera. I'm counseling, and I'm not certified for this, but people reach out to me because it's one of the few people they feel they can talk to. They can't talk to their bishop. They can't talk to other people. But maybe it's a couple that's in a mixed marriage, or maybe it's the people that are having a faith crisis and they want to talk things through. Now, do I try to bludgeon them and say, "No, you need to leave that church, blah, blah, blah"? And I said, "Listen, just tell me where you're at." And some of them are like, "You know what? I just love Jesus, man." I said, "Amen. Just love Jesus." And that's and make that the basis of your faith. And
Okay.
And that's just, to me, it's like Jesus for Mormons. Yeah, Steve's for Mormons. I mean, I have a heart for the people. I love the Restoration Latter-day. I have a heart for Joseph Smith. I feel like I have a lot in common with him, especially the young Joseph Smith. So to me, it's like I just sense that I just have a very charitable view, a more charitable view than normal of the Restoration coming from the evangelical camp. But I honestly think that if I was just doing what everybody else was doing, I'm not furthering the conversation. If it's just about bashing the church and showing what's wrong and how or where they disagree, it's like, then we're not actually moving the conversation along. Like I talked to Dr. Kyle Bashirs about this. I said, one of the privileges that we have is that we get to see the pearls of the Restoration, that the critics, the people outside protesting or writing hit pieces on Latter-day Saints, we get to see the pearls of the Restoration. I said, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. And there's a beautiful spirit in many people, individuals. And again, I'm talking about individuals. I'm not talking about institutions, that are wonderful, Christ-centered followers of Jesus, and that they love the Lord. And those are the kind of Latter-day Saints that reach out to me. So I get to see their pearls that they would never share with these adversarial evangelical groups that want to attack and jump down and tell them they're going to hell because of what building they go to on Sunday morning.
And to me, Steve, if I'm being very honest, there are two sides to this, right? Like, as you're talking, we do not fight against flesh and blood, right? But we fight against principalities, against dominions, against, those forces. There's that side of it, this loving and compassionate, side of me that is very much aligned with you. Like, I see people in faith crisis, and there's a very human side of me that is just like, I've been there, and that is terrible. and it sucks to be there. I mean, it's really, really bad. But then there's also this doctrinal side of me, or maybe this theology side of me, that says that as I see people walk into a Mormon church, those people are learning a different message of who God is and who they are in relation to God. And so to me, I make that distinction of, I do believe it matters, right? Because does that make sense, Steve?
I think our differences do matter, and I think that the beautiful thing about it is I'm able to go on very faithful Latter-day Saint podcasts. I mean, we're talking about some of the biggest ones out there, right? And have been invited to go on some even larger ones, and I'm able to articulate, if you will, confessional Christianity to a Latter-day Saint audience, and they receive it, and they're appreciative of it. And so for me, it's like I'm literally just sharing the gospel with the Latter-day Saints, telling them this is where we agree and this is why we disagree. Jesus, God having a body, that kind of stuff, but then get pushed back from Jacob Hansen. Well, Jesus has a body. I'm like, hey, let's have that conversation, Jacob Hansen, and we do. That's the beautiful thing, is that we're able to look. I spend hours on what you see on camera is a minuscule compared to the kind of really important conversations I'm having with Latter-day Saints. They're very influential, and also but not more importantly, the people you've never heard of that will never go on a podcast, having those kinds of conversations with them. And you understand, it's like, look, the Evangelical Church is so big, so powerful, and so it has such a major influence on the Latter-day Saint world. Many of them have told me that they grew up watching Billy Graham. Many of them, hearing Christian messages. So I really think that they're more receptive of hearing what we have to say than, of course, many evangelicals are receptive of them. So for me, it's like, look, Jacob Hansen has gone on my podcast and on his own podcast and said, yes, I've said the sinner's prayer. See, to me, that's important. I had a church employee. I didn't know at the time. I'm on the Zoom call, and I'm talking to this guy who's like articulating a pretty orthodox, like arguably even more orthodox view of God and Christianity than that was amazing. And I didn't even know who he was after a 2-hour conversation. I said, by the way, I noticed you're in an office. Where you work at? He said, let me walk to the window. I walk, and he shines his camera down. It's Temple Square. He works in the church office building. So that's those I get to see and have those kinds of conversations with people that other unfortunately, and I'm sure there's actually some really good ministries, honestly, in Utah. There's fantastic churches, fantastic ministries, but then there's I kind of consider them almost fringy people that have decided they're going to be gatekeepers, including to me. And I'm like, listen, I'm actually having these great conversations with people. I've talked to people who said, I became a born-again Christian reading the Book of Mormon, and they're not members of the church. So, to me, like, you have those different types of conversations, you see a whole other side to the restoration. That is really remarkable. These are people that love Jesus, man. And yes, I know we have disagreements about the nature of God. We have disagreements about even, what happens in eternity. And I do, like I was telling you on the phone, I said, Joseph, a lot of people speculate about the eternity. A lot of people want to know what does it look like after we beyond, once we pass, what does eternity look like? How does it work? And throughout the centuries, Christians have had different speculations. Some have even thought that there was a preexistence. Others had talked about maybe there being some progress in the eternities. So the idea is that this is a conversation that's been having, and it's hard. Look, none of us can know for sure what eternity looks like. I think Joseph Smith was making speculations. I think sometimes I sometimes wonder if maybe he was making speculations that maybe we should look at as speculations, but it's been canonized and baked into the restoration. But I think, and he was influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg and a lot of people in those periods of time. So he was kind of just like this DIY theologian who was just taking bits and pieces from everywhere and integrating into his worldview. But then there's a lot of different Latter-day Saints. Like, it's like sometimes, I talk to Catholics who don't believe in the real presence in the sacrament.
Hmm.
So, so to me, it's like, I'd much rather deal with the individual. I don't go look at a person, have them stand in front of me, and then hold up the doctrinal statement of their church and say, this is what you believe. Okay, I'm going to judge you based on the doctrinal statement of your church. No, I'm going to put that to the side and say, let's talk about Jesus. Who is Jesus to you? And have those kinds of conversations. And when you put aside the doctrinal statements, the man-made creeds and theologies and the philosophies of men, and you just have a conversation about Jesus and put that at the center of the conversation, which I always try to bring the conversation back to the center is Jesus. That's why I do this thing called the 3 questions that I tell evangelicals. These are the 3 questions you need to ask a Latter-day Saint. 1, what is your favorite Book of Mormon story? 2, what is your favorite Bible story? And 3, who is Jesus to you? And if you start off that conversation with Latter-day Saints that way, it's going to be a much more positive and constructive conversation rather than just trying to badger them with their doctrines and their statements of beliefs. Let's admit, on a personal level, I'm much more interested in, like I tell people, I'm a fruit inspector. So if somebody goes to me and says, I'm a Christian, I'm like, okay, let me see the fruits. And if I see good fruits, then I'm like, okay, obviously I see the fruits. It's real simple. Jesus gave us the formula. And so if I see good fruits, I'm like, okay, they're probably a Christian. But ultimately, I don't know. God's the ultimate on that. I think it's way above our pay grade to be these gatekeepers that determine who's in and out, who's an evangelical, who's a Christian. To me, it's like, no, like, let's sit down. Let's sit down on Zoom and look eye to eye and have a conversation rather than get behind the keyboard and attack me. Why not get to know people? Yeah, I think it's just really important to be on a personal one-on-one level with people, and that's where it's at. I think that's exactly how Jesus would handle it.
Yeah, and I think we've had that, right, Steve? I call you, you call me. We've had dialogue, and I still think this is a for me personally, this is a sticking point though for who Jesus is. And what Jesus I think about it this way. The Muslims, right? They see Jesus as something, and they see the deity of Jesus as a certain way. And they actually regard Jesus in a certain way with a certain reverence, right? Jews see Jesus in a certain way. They obviously don't acknowledge his deity as well, and what he is and who he was. And Christians see his deity a certain way, right?
Yes,
and
but
so,
this is the thing, Kai. Like most, but if you were to ask most Christians to articulate the makeup of God and to articulate the Trinity, they will inevitably utter a heresy because they usually can't get none of that stuff right. So the problem is that if we're just judging people on what their church's beliefs about the nature of God, and rather than what is the individual's beliefs, often are very different. And so I think it's like, look, I look at it this way. I'm a Trinitarian, but the doctrine of the Trinity was not in the first century church. At best, it was Binitarianism, okay? Which is okay for me, because if the first century Christians were Binitarian, I'm not saying they're going to hell because they weren't Trinitarian. So I use the same thing with this whole, but I look at the Trinity as being man's best attempt to try to understand the nature of God and his relationship within the Godhead, right? Like, how does that work? But it's a man-made articulation. So I can't say you're a Christian or not a Christian based on man-made creeds. They can give us guideposts, but I look at the guideposts that Jesus gives us. You're knowing them by their fruits. To me, that's more important. If you're seeing the fruits manifesting in an individual, and I like to tell people, and I make the comment, I believe there's Christians in the Jehovah's Witness Church. I believe there's Christians in the Catholic Church. I believe there's Christians that are in the Muslim world. I believe there's Christians in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I think there might even be some Christians in the Evangelical Church too. It's kind of as a joke. But my point being...
oh my gosh. No. Hey, Steve, you want to know what? I can take a good joke, and you totally had me going down the line, and then you did the Uno reverse card. And so I can take it. I think that now you make me lose my train of thought. I think there is this idea, though, in order to gain access to a group of people, let's just say, is there this idea of, and this is taken straight from Fred Anson's article, and you might get a solid eye roll on this one. Is there an idea of pandering and slandering? Is there this idea that I am, in order to get access, I have to kind of say, on this Christian world, we're also, confused on this, which is kind of beating down Christianity in a way, right? Or there is infighting in this doctrine or this doctrine. But you guys have this thing, whether that's the Book of Mormon or a prophet or whatever, that is kind of, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, you kind of beat something down to gain access, and then once you have that access, you can have a dialogue. I think is where people might split, right?
Well, first of all, I have been critical. Well, look, I went on Mormon Stories and told my story, and I said one of the things that caused my shelf to get really heavy was when I first started encountering Christian apologetics. I recognized right then and there when I was looking, this book right here, this is the one that did it. All right. This is what
I can't see that the text on that. If you want to tell me,
demands a verdict by Josh McDowell. So I went on Mormon Stories. I told this story, okay, and that's the first time I ever told that story. And so I was in doing my YouTube channel for a year, and I came on and said, that when I read, I really thought, like, okay, Paul says we need to have a ready answer. So I thought the time's come. I just assumed there's these great apologists, these great men of God. They were going out into the marketplace. They were defending Christianity, and they were winning all these debates on the college campuses, and we are crushing atheism, right? This is my naive world that I lived in. And okay. I thought, but you know what? I really need to study apologetics to get a better understanding so that I can have a ready answer. I opened this thing, and then on one of the opening chapters, Josh says the Bible is scientifically proven. I was like, whoa, okay, this is great. I need to look at that footnote. The footnote was John C. Whitcomb's Genesis Flood, Young Earth Creationism. It was at that moment when I realized, like, whoa, they're not doing apologetics to reach the lost. They're doing apologetics to keep people in the church. And once I had that aha moment, I said, okay, I need to educate myself in real science, biology, evolution, atheism. And I tell people I read myself out of Christianity. And so for me, I'm critical of apologists, not because I personally dislike them. Actually, I like many of them. I'm critical because I feel like they're ineffective. And I feel like they could do better. As a matter of fact, I literally went to Mormonism Research's headquarters on my last trip to Utah, met with Bill McKeever, and said, listen, I want to help you guys. I want to actually help you guys do better apologetics, or better, actually not apologetics, I don't really like the term apologetics, better research. I said, I've got access to all these scholars and at the Mormon History Association, and I'm having dialogue with them. And I think it's really important for you guys to get involved in these conversations with other theologians, and like Kyle Bashirs is doing. And I actually want to go back and tell you something. One of the most important things that Dr. Kyle Bashirs, graduated from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, was assistant pastor at a mega church in Mobile, Alabama. He went on a Latter-day Saint program, Gospel Tangents, and I was there in the room while it was being taped. This because they were taping it here at my Christian Community. He was talking to Rick Bennett. And Kyle said, Jesus didn't turn over the tables in the temple in Samaria. He turned over the tables in his own community, in Jerusalem. The point being is a lot of evangelical apologists make the argument, well, Jesus turned over the tables, and he calls the ruckus. That's what we're doing with these Latter-day Saints. And I'm like, no, but Jesus didn't go to Samaria and overturn the tables in their temple. He did it in his own temple. So when I say I'm more critical of Christian apologists than I am of Mormonism, it's because I'm turning over the tables in my own community. I'm not going into their community and turning over the tables. And I think that that's a really important position to take. I think it's really important to engage people in love, and with and also John DeLynn said one of the most important things. It's a mantra that I go by. John DeLynn said all of us need to practice epistemological humility. So I go in with like, I don't know all the answers. I don't know what eternity looks like. I don't know how a lot of these things work. I'm still a student, still trying to learn myself. I'm not going to go around and lecture people about this is what I believe, and this is what you believe, and this is why you're wrong, and I'm right. That's essentially what happens in many cases. I'm not interested in having that conversation. I'd rather say, man, let's just talk about Jesus. Then let's talk about our differences. And I think if you bring the conversation back to Christ, and I tell people, said, it's not about works. I say, well, it is about works, but it's about the work that Jesus does through me, not the work that I do. And so those are the kind of conversations I want to have about grace and works, and you just do it in easily in a way that's very plain spoken, and done in a way that I think is much more effective than trying to use a lot of fancy big words and show all this stuff about early church history and all this doctrinal stuff, which are admittedly man-made. I'd rather just have go back to the basics of the conversation and talk about. I tell people, said, it's all about the work that Christ did at the cross. That's central to everything. Everything else is an appendage.
Well, you're quoting Joseph Smith there.
Yeah, sometimes I do.
He did say that. He said everything that we do, Jesus is what? Man, I'm going to butcher this one. Jesus is the core of everything that we do, and everything else in the church is an appendage to that. And
just real quick, just to say one more last thing. Here's this interesting conversations going on with Kyle Beshears and Jeff McCullough, where they're talking to Latter-day Saints about the Apostles' Creed, and how Latter-day Saints, there's nothing in the Apostles' Creed that Latter-day Saints would disagree with. So to me, it's like, all right, awesome. Here's another place we can have the conversation. Like, to me, I that's what's called making progress. I mean, the fact that the church is changing on the Google Maps, the angel Moroni to a cross. I mean, they're embracing the cross, which was verboten at one time with David O. McKay's correlations. I mean, I just think that over the course of time, like, I'm a long-term person. I think over the course of decades, we could start seeing more and more of these changes happening in the church. And I tell people, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ain't going anywhere. The other thing I feel like it's important to, what if you want to call it a ministry, is to advocate for reforms in the church in my own little way, talking about more transparency from the leadership and finances, and say, like when I had that bishop, that ex-Mormon bishop that resigned from the pulpit last year in Mississippi, and was on he was only on two podcasts. He was on Mormon Stories, and then a few days later he was on my channel. Now, he did the whole Mormon Stories thing. That was great. He did that whole thing. But then he came on my channel, which is a faithful audience. Of course, Mormon Stories would be mostly, more critical, of course, right? An ex-Mormon. And goes on my channel to a more faithful audience. And we said, look, you know what it's like to be a bishop and how difficult it is and the lack of training they receive. What are some things you could do to help reform things so that bishops are able to do a better job? So this was a constructive criticism, because in my mind, I feel like if people are going to be in that church, and church ain't going anywhere, then why don't we make it a safer space for them as well by advocating positive changes? And on that video with a largely faithful audience, 98% thumbs up from the audience on my YouTube algorithm. That's pretty remarkable. And the next week I'm at my local ward and somebody comes up to me and says, boy, I really like that bishop, the guy who resigned from the pulpit. So to me, it's like, I'd much rather have those kinds of dialogues and conversations and also try to advocate for positive reforms happening in the church. And then, because I come from a Reformed tradition and we believe the church should always be reforming. And so I think that's another important thing as well. Look, these are all fellow image bearers. We all are. And they're all created in the image of God. We're all created in his image. And so I think that because we're all fellow images bearers, we need to have this really, we're all sacred in that sense, because we're created from his image. And so I think that we need to have our conversations based on this. And when I first started this channel, God had put me in a place where I was on one side of the street with this group of people holding up signs. And then across the street were the other people holding up signs opposing my worldview. And God put me there and he said, now look at those people across the street. He said, just remember, those are also fellow image bearers. So when you're engaging people you disagree with, just say fellow image bearer, fellow image bearer. And there are times when I'm talking to somebody and I can't stand it, and I just have to say fellow image bearer, fellow image bearer.
Well, is there a point though where you have to sacrifice some of your core beliefs in order to minister in that world?
So,
and that's kind of where I'm at, is I look at it and I've said, fresh coming out of the Mormon church, I don't know what my theology is. Are Mormons Christian? Are they not Christian? Do they believe the same Jesus? Do they not? You get all of these different things. And so I think to have people in the middle can really muddy the water, as opposed to having this clean break from, this is a different gospel. This is being taught. This is a different Jesus. This is a different, that makes a really clean break for who God is and who we are, right, in relation to him. And so to say, like, okay, there are some sacrifices I'm making, and I think that I haven't done enough research on this to say if maybe Paul was doing that, right? When he's talking about the temple of the unknown God, is he making a sacrifice there? I'm not really sure. When he's trying to speak to these people, I mean, that is obviously not that would obviously be a controversial take for somebody to do right now.
I am in many ways, I'm patterning myself after Paul by having these conversations. I think I'm very Pauline in that way. I think that the engagement, look, when people complain about, like, oh, there's all these influences on all these groups and this is what makes them wrong, I'm like, you do realize that Paul quoted from a pagan poet about a pagan God, put it in the Bible, and then use that to also talk about our God. That's pretty. In him we move, and I forget that. I can't remember it off the top, but I'm just saying he's literally taking pagan poetry and putting it in the Bible. Can you imagine if Christian apologists were using pagan sources to bolster their belief system today? They'd be, you're out of here. What are you doing? You're that's the wrong team. You didn't make a clean break.
Yeah, and I also think that if you say, hey, because I do think that environment is important. Right? Like, I think a Bible believing church is where people should be, where all people should be. And I think to muddy that and have all of this other theology, whether that's the temple, whether that is, saving ordinances, saved by grace after all we can do, all of these very problematic things being taught in a Mormon church every single week. I mean, that's where maybe me and you diverge in, I don't care what building you go to. And I won't just say it's Mormonism. I think there are other bad environments that we can put ourselves in. I mean, people can imagine whatever they want to imagine in this scenario, but there's other environments you can put yourself in where you're probably being influenced in a negative way. That may not be the most positive. And I think that's really where, we're going to probably split on this discussion and just say, I think that by having it say, I don't care which church you go to, I think that kind of muddies it.
When I always say, I don't say what church, I say, I don't care what building you go to. Because to me, the church is not a building. A church is the body of Christ, which are the individual members. So I believe that, you can be in communion and be in fellowship with people that attend various buildings, but that's just all that it is. It's a building you go to on Sunday or Saturday. The church is the people. So that's even the idea of what is church. Well, Bryn Jones, who was a leader of the charismatic movement church in England, I went to a camp meeting where he was talking, a weekend retreat, and he said, "What is the church?" He says, "Bible tells us where two or more are gathered in my name." So he said, so when the two of you are together, that's church service. That's church. So you and I having this conversation, we're having church right now. That's what the church is to me. And so that means there are people in different, like you hear stories about people who, have in the Muslim world where they have visions of Jesus and they convert. They're still going to the mosque. They're still going through these things, but they have a personal relationship with Jesus. Those are Christians. You see, I don't care what building they go to on Friday. Do you have a personal relationship with the Savior? And if you do, you're part of the church.
Yeah, and I still understand the heart behind it, right? I definitely understand the heart, right? I'm a very people person. I love people, but I also think that if you love people, you speak something into them that is helpful and that will push them in a direction that is knowing the real Jesus.
And that's precisely in many ways you could argue that I'm doing. When I go to people to a Latter-day Saint and say it is about works, but it's not the work that I'm doing, it's the work that he's doing through me. That to me makes people think. Look, and we have many people in the Latter-day Saint tradition that are moving towards a more grace-based views. Of Jackson Washburn, who was raised simultaneously in a evangelical home, every Sunday he was going to an evangelical church and he was going to a Mormon church. And he loves a lot of ideas of evangelicalism, and he just graduated from Harvard Divinity School, and he wants to kind of bring more evangelical grace-based theology into Mormonism. And he is like one of the superstars of Mormon scholarship that's going to have a major impact on that church. I want to encourage that. I want that, more of that to happen. I want to see them grapple with these issues like we all do. Look, there are legalistic churches within our tradition, including the Church of Christ. The Church of the Nazarene. There are legal. James Dobson's church is the Church of the Nazarene. Some would argue that maybe he's not a Christian if you're into legalism. And then the Catholic Church, of course, they have a different view on things, but they essentially set the standard of what all the theology is, what determines what a Christian is. But then there's a lot of these same apologists will take all this Catholic theology, but then they'll say Catholics are going to hell. It's like, so it gets really, that to me muddies the waters. I think trying to put to be the gatekeeper and try to put people into different categories. And I tell people, I said, there's a certain level of Christian apologists and Mormon apologists that don't like me because they can't put me in the box. They're trying to say, oh, Steve's this, Steve's a progressive. Well, I know what the language is on that. Once you label somebody a progressive, you're basically saying they're really not a Christian. So we don't have to deal with that. I'm like, no, I'm not letting you put that label on me because I am not a progressive. I've never said that I am one. And I'm sorry, I think we probably share more in common than you probably even could imagine. And so to me, the muddying of the waters happens is when you see all these groups, like in the 1980s, you had these wars between music wars about what kind of music you're going to play in your church. You had church splits over that. Well, we sing from the blue Psalter hymnal or the red one, and you got this blue one, and that's wrong. And so to me, it's like by standing firmly for the doctrines of the church and standing firmly with having this idea that they're not giving an inch, that actually muddies the waters. Why? Because look what happens when their kids grow up. They tend to leave the church, or they go to a different church than their parents when people take these really strong positions. And then to the outside, to the world, they look at it and they see all these different churches and they're splitting off. It's like, man, they can't figure anything out. And it's all based on this idea that we have to make a clean break.
Well, I think, and I want to cut you off because I think that there's a difference between music preference.
Well, I'm talking about theology. Look, we had in the Christian Reformed Church in the 80s, they had a big thing about women in office.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with it next. Yeah. It's like there are these things but everyone still considers himself to be in the body of Christ. They still consider, I mean, if you were to ask me, I mean,
not
okay,
necessarily,
if we say not necessarily, are we talking 90% believe that most people aren't in the body of Christ? Or are we talking about 5%?
I grew up in an environment in which we would get into these huge arguments about infant baptism. We would get into these huge arguments about what the true church is. I mean, I knew plenty of Protestant Reformed Christians who told me that Christian Reformed Church are not true Christians and they're going to hell. Okay, and so the reality is, and I've heard CRC people go to and say that, you know, charismatics are not true Christians. That's the word. My parents met with the radio minister, the biggest, best known ministry in the Christian Reformed Church, the Back to God Hour, and he basically just tried to destroy them and attack them. So for me, it's like, look, I grew up in the world watching the John Ankerberg program, where they one week they'd say Mormons aren't Christians, and then the next week they say charismatics and Pentecostals aren't Christians. I mean, that's the world I grew up in, and it's the same world that Joseph Smith grew up in. I could totally understand why he'd see all the chaos in this world with all these different evangelical sects battling each other out. And then when the Presbyterian pastor goes to the Smith family and says that Leuven is burning in hell because he didn't receive a Presbyterian baptism, that's way beyond his pay grade. He should have never said that. And I tell people that's why evangelicals have to own this whole thing, because that put Joseph Smith. I tell people that's one of the points where Mormonism began, was those words of that Presbyterian minister.
Well, I don't think that people now pay for the past sins of other people. Well, I believe maybe
it's that same spirit. It's that same spirit.
It's, you know, I believe that men will be punished for their own sins and not for previous transgressions. Come on, I quoted Joseph Smith. You quoted Joseph Smith. There we go.
That's fine. That's fair. I love it.
So my point in saying that is, I don't believe that the Christian church owes anything to anyone for something that was said 200 years ago. I don't think, and I think we have to separate the church from. You don't agree with me? Oh wow.
No, well,
you think that there is some penitence that has to be paid by the Christian church for what was said 200 years ago?
Well, I just kind of look at it from the perspective of, look how much criticism the Mormon Church says that we never seek or offer apologies. We never apologize for anything. So they never apologized to the African Americans for what they went through. They never apologized for the Mountain Meadows massacre. You know, I mean, to me, I think that repentance and actually acknowledging the sins of your movement from the past, I think, are really important. Even the Southern Baptists renounced slavery, even though they were founded as a pro-slavery church. And they were criticized for even doing that in the 1990s by some people on the right. So no, I think that if we want the institution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to apologize for some of the misdeeds of the past, I think we should hold to the same standard that the Christians. Look, I mean, there's.
Well, I'm gonna go in with this one, Steve. The pastor that co-hosts Jesus for Mormons,
yes,
Ideals, has gone out. We love Di. Di is awesome, and she has apologized to people who have experienced religious trauma at the hands of the Mormon Church, and who have experienced religious trauma at all. And I think that that's a really good thing to do. But I don't think that you can look at something that a wrong of the past and say that's a justification for what is happening right now. And you can look at that and say this is my get out of jail free card to say, well, it's okay that this injustice is still happening now because of this wrong that I experienced 200 years ago. I believe that the Mormon Church and the Mormon leadership has wronged me of years of my life, preaching a gospel that I believe is false.
Okay, that's fair.
I'm not, and so I come into this very loaded.
Yeah.
And with that, I'm not looking for an apology from them. My justice comes from the Lord.
Okay. That's fine.
Right? Like that's who rains down judgment on people preaching false doctrine, is the Lord. It has nothing to do with Jeffrey R. Holland could call me tomorrow, probably my favorite apostle in the church. He could call me tomorrow and he could say, Kai, I'm sorry. And I would say, I appreciate you out of the blue giving me a call, but I've already handed that hurt over to the Lord. And to me, in my mind, it doesn't really do much, because I know that Jesus and what he did is enough for me.
And that's fine.
I don't need anything else.
That's fine for you. But there's a lot of people that aren't in the same place that you are, that are still hurting, that have been devastating. And the idea of restitution and doing right by people and apologizing for past sins is actually can be a healing moment, not only for an individual, but for people in general, and also for institutions to kind of be held account. And you have to understand this. I think the difference between you and I is that you deconstructed your Mormon faith, but I deconstructed all faith and became an atheist for 13 years. So I come with this with the deconstructed lens of Christianity. And that still very much influences my worldview. But it just makes it so much more, for me, it is a clarifying experience, because I've been able to make a clean break from all of the traditions and all the doctrines of men and all the theology and all the things that caused the Christians to battle each other through all these years. I made a clean break from that and kind of reconstituting my faith on this idea of just follow the simple principles, just stick with Jesus. Don't let all the institutional and historical and theological things from the past. Let's build something different for the future. And that includes having conversations with like-minded people who share many of the same values, who all testify and confess with their mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord. And anybody who's willing to make that confession that Jesus Christ is Lord, then those are people that I want to continue to have positive, constructive dialogue and not try to get into arguments and debates, because I see the futility of that. It's a time waster. It makes no progress. That's why I get so frustrated with Mormon apologists as well as Christian apologists, because we're literally just having the same conversations from 50 years ago. That's not progress. I just think it's time we have a different type of conversation. And I'm not bashing them. I'm just saying what used to work in the past no longer works. It's not effective. And I feel like we need to just have a different lens of going about how we're going to engage people that are different than us.
And Steve, as I've thought about this conversation, it's really made me think of how me and you are aligned in a certain way. For me personally, I have a hard time evangelizing to true believing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Very hard time, because there is so much past hurt and so much past, like I said, I mean, maybe that came out when I said I wasted 2 years of my life preaching a false gospel. I mean, that doesn't, that's loaded with hurt, right?
Yeah.
And so I look at you and I look at maybe your criticisms towards Christianity, and I wonder if there is past hurt associated with that.
Oh,
maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's a projection. And if it's wrong,
I went through extraordinary religious and spiritual PTSD. I spoke with Randy Bell, who's an expert on PTSD and had a podcast about it and wrote books about it. He told me, he says, I don't think I've talked to somebody that's experienced more PTSD than you, Steve. And this is a guy who literally goes for insurance and he's called the master disaster, goes around to the places of human caused disaster. So he's one of the first people on the scene at the Heaven's Gate compound, one of the first people at the 9/11. He was one of the first people at the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. He's one of the first people at, he was involved in consulting the O.J. Simpson, the Nicole Brown Simpson family during the O.J. Simpson trial. This is a man who's seen trauma firsthand and has seen evil in its eyes. I mean, he still believes. Now, he was Latter-day Saints. Now he's a Protestant Christian. But he said, I don't think I've ever seen somebody who's experienced more than you. And I said, dude, it's just my story. There's nothing to it. So that's part of my story that I talked on Mormon Stories too, is about how Jesus is causing healing in my life. And I will tell you, the Lord showed me, I feel like early on, the Lord gave me an image of a particular apologist and basically said, I'm sending you here. I got the impression I'm sending you here to help clean up the mess that he made. And so that's kind of like my mission, is to clean up the mess that some of the hurt things, some of the horrible things that these apologists have said about evangelicals, have said about Catholics, have said about Jews, have said about all the other people that are different than them, including the LGBTQ community. I think it's really important to come in there and say, listen, this ain't about the labels, and this ain't about the building you go to. This is about, do you have a personal relationship with the Savior? And is he working through you? Are you doing it? Are you doing the work, or is he doing the work? Is this his ministry, or is this your ministry? And to me, that's like really important. That's why the man-made stuff can be helpful. Calvinism can be helpful. The Wesley brothers can be helpful. Lutheran can be helpful to inform the conversation. But to basically kind of canonize these people and make them part of your worldview, that the lens that you view the world, I think it can be very dangerous. So I think that, de facto.
Well, can I throw Joseph Smith in there?
Yeah. Joseph Smith. If Joseph Smith gets in the way of you having a personal relationship with Jesus, you need to push him out of the way.
Okay. So I look at my whole generation, looking at the problematic church history things, and saying, I will never step foot in a church ever again.
Any church?
Any church. I told somebody that I was baptized into an evangelical church, somebody that I used to be in an elders quorum presidency with, and he laughed. He thought I was joking. He said, that is the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. I said, no, man, I had this encounter with God.
Yeah.
And it changed my life.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe where I look at some of this. And you had Jacob Hansen on.
Yeah.
You said he said the sinner's prayer. For me, when I did that and I gave my life to Christ, everything changed for me.
Okay.
It wasn't a nominal, hey, I went down Romans Road and read all the things in Romans, and here I am. I did it as a fail-safe Hail Mary. It was not that. It was, Jesus, I give everything to you. Everything. My goals, my ambitions, my theology of my past, all of that gets laid down. And I walk a completely different life after that. I am changed after that.
And, I think it's important. I really want to honor your conversion experience, but I always tell people, I say, I'm not going to base other people's conversion experiences based on mine. So I look at it this way, is that when somebody says the sinner's prayer or gives it all up and says, Jesus, I'm putting everything, I'm giving you everything, and I'm going to sacrifice. Sometimes it can be an instantaneous life-changing thing. Other times when somebody does it, maybe we don't see it manifest itself right away, but that might plant the seed that you slowly but surely see this person being turned into a new creature. And for some people, it might be an immediate process. Other times they'd be like, I've noticed there's something different about you.
And I speak to that too. I mean, I think that your theology changes, your lifestyle changes. You start to see you start to heal, right? You start to heal from all of the bad, spiritual things or whatever trauma that people have. Like that is something, but in a way when, and I shouldn't cast any judgment on Jacob Hansen, but in a way it was like a token thing to me. And maybe that's my own projection. And maybe that's wrong, but I think that it should make you say, I reevaluate my theology because I'm putting Jesus so much higher. And I reevaluate the false things that I've been taught in my life, and I'm willing to sacrifice those to follow fair. Jesus.
I think that's fair. And I think actually I want Christian apologists to consider doing the same thing. I think sometimes when I see a legalistic spirit, when I see things where everything has to be done by the book, and in order for me to talk to you, Steve, you have to do this, and that. I'm like, none of that's in the Bible. One of the stipulations was I needed to be a member of a local church. That's not in the Bible. But okay, then I joined a local church. And that's the wrong local church, Steve. It just, So, I was in the process of looking for a church. But, the beautiful thing was, I remember when I went on Mormon Stories, and I really thought I was going to break down and really be like, oh my gosh, because I'm going to talk about past childhood trauma and all the abuse that I received. And I said, and it didn't happen. And I realized at that moment that I was healed. Jesus had done the work in me. As a matter of fact, a couple years into this, I quit taking medication for my depression. I was like,
Praise God.
I've been healed. And so he's done the work in me. And now I want to share that with everybody. I'm going to go and go in a few minutes. I'm going to head out, and the young man is going to open up an envelope to see where his Mormon mission is going to be. And I'm going to be there and just be supportive in my own way, and just show how much I just really appreciate these people. These people have opened their home to me. When I was in a hurricane, they let me use their shower.
Really?
That's Christ-like. Yes.
That's beautiful.
This is, to me, is the beautiful thing. I had the Bickertonites, who are Book of Mormon believers. I stayed at their place during the hurricane. There was plenty of Christians who lived around here. They didn't offer that. So to me, it's like, I just look at it like, man, that's Jesus manifesting. Oh, I see the fruits there. And I always tell people, I said, the problem that we have is that we're always, as adversarial relationships with other people that are different, we're always looking for the devil in the details. And I always say, don't look for the devil, look for the Jesus. And then you can see that and once you start looking for Jesus, you'll find him in a lot of different places you would never expect, and be blown out of the water and realize that the grace of God is so awesome and so powerful. It's beyond anything that we could comprehend. And rather than us fighting here on earth, and making us look like fools to the world, let's be a light. Let's be that salt. Because I feel as a people, in many ways, we've lost our prophetic, our prophetic voice by trading it in for raw political power. And I think that's been a detriment to my community. And I think the time, and like I tell people, I said, I left the evangelical community 20 years ago, the village. And when I come back, the village is on fire. And it is. So for me, my heart goes out to the people in my community. That's what I love. That's what I want to minister to as much as anybody, because I love the evangelical world. And I think that my story can be part of the conversation that can also be helpful to keep people from leaving the church, or maybe find a way back. More importantly, not to the building, but to the church, the body of Christ.
I would say that the evangelical church is on fire too, for the Lord. Full revival. Let's go. Let's go. Okay.
I so wish that was true. I really do. We really do need revival. We really do.
Oh, I believe it, and it's coming.
Okay, amen.
I believe in the Mormon revival. I'm going to throw that out there. I believe that a massive theological change can happen in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They can put away all of those old doctrines, everything that is taught in the temple, and they can just follow Jesus. And they can know who he really is. 17 million people worshiping the one true God. I believe that can happen. I believe that is really what could happen, and nothing is greater than what the Lord could do in that perspective. And I would hope that really happens. Steve,
Kai,
hopefully you feel like this has not been too contentious.
No, matter of fact, I'm really pleased with how Christ affirming this conversation was.
Yeah, and I think that one of the criticisms that I want to end with a positive,
okay,
is it was you shared that you shared with me even before we hit record on this podcast that you are going to share you shared the Bickertonite Book of Mormon with people.
Yes,
a pocket size a Book of Mormon from that sect, and that was something that was donated to you.
Yes,
from another group. Mm-hmm. This is actually something that is really near and dear to my heart. As I was serving a mission in St. Louis, Missouri, someone didn't want to have a conversation with me as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, missionary tag on, the whole nine works. They did not want to have a conversation with me. But what they did is they handed me a small red letter New Testament Bible. I read that, and it definitely piqued an interest in me. I don't think it was something that made me say, "Oh, I want to leave my mission and follow the Christian idea of being saved in Christianity." But it was something that I read and I thought, right on, this is really, really cool. And so with that, as a peace offering, if you feel like this was really contentious, I would love to send you 20. So I put a number on it, 20 CSB pocket-sized Bibles. So I'll get your address and, I'll ship those over to you as a peace offering.
That is so great. That's what I've been going. I said, I had this brother who gave me these Book of Mormons, and I loved it, and I appreciate it. And so I said, I'm going to start giving these to Mormon missionaries. So every Mormon missionary gets a Bickertonite Book of Mormon. They're like, what is this? And gets their wheels turning. And I want to give them a New Testament and say, hey, here's, and I love it because I even put it out there. Send me some New Testaments, guys, the critics, the haters, send them, and I'll give them out to the missionaries. And they also, you should get your own, buy your own. I'm like, okay, whatever. The point was showing the gifting, the idea of like this brother who loves the Lord he went and gave me some Book of Mormons, and I want other brothers who love the Lord who'd say, let's do this, Steve. Let's help Steve give New Testaments to Mormon missionaries. Thank you so much for blessing me today, Kai, with that gesture. I really appreciate you, and God bless you.
Yeah, definitely. I will, we can do that. And so with that, I really appreciate having you on, Steve. I've read all these things, and I love the human element of having this discussion. And, you obviously have a position. I have a position. I just want people to know, there's this imagery in my mind of, is Steve a fellow sheep, who's being guided by Jesus? Or is he a wolf in sheep's clothing? Like maybe these articles have maybe told me that you are. And so I think it's important, and I'll let people decide that. I mean, I love you. I love having discussions with you and having this dialogue with you. And I really appreciate you, coming on. I always like my guests to have the last word so that I don't feel that I'm talking over them.
Okay.
Because I can talk for days.
Well, Kai,
Steve,
first of all,
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to thank you for having me on the program today. I really appreciate you. You and I have spent many hours on the phone talking with each other. I think you'll probably agree that the person that's on the camera is very similar to the person that's on the phone. And I think that if people would actually take the time to get to know me rather than be a keyboard warrior, but actually reach out and say, hey, let's just have a talk. Let's hop on Zoom, and I want to get to know you better. You're a fellow image bearer, so I need to, honor that and not try to be contentious or try to win some debate online, which I don't participate in debates. I hate them. I think they're counterproductive. I want us to just get to know each other, talk to each other, know where somebody's heart is. And let's just come. Let us reason together.
Beautiful. Well, on my next episode, I'm actually interviewing Aaron. And so that will be an interesting thing. Steve, if I interview Aaron and I've interviewed you, would you come back on and have a dialogue? You guys would both have the information. Would you come back on and have a dialogue with Aaron and have that face-to-face interaction?
I'm happy to have some kind of dialogue with him, whether it happens first. I think we should have a private Zoom conversation. And then after that, I would love to do something. I would definitely be open to having that kind of dialogue. Absolutely. And if we use your platform, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Beautiful. All right. Well, on that, I love you guys. Thank you for tuning in to Jesus for Mormons.
Bye.